All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a great Thursday night out there, wherever you may be. My name is Matthew Berger. I'm one of the co-owners of Mysterious Galaxy. And tonight we have Rudy Ruiz, who is celebrating the release of The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez. And we have Charlie Lovett, who is celebrating the release of Escaping Dreamland. So I am the Vanna White of this show. So let me just tell you a little bit of how Crowdcast works. So you'll see down below, there's a section where it says say something nice. Go ahead and leave your comments there, chat with each other. There's another section where it says ask a question. If you want to ask the authors anything at any time, put your questions there and they'll be able to see it. And when we get to the Q&A part, they will field all of your questions. And the only other important thing to note is that down below it says order signed books. So if you want to get either of these books that we're talking about today and get them signed, which is an amazing thing, very hard to get signed books right now. So feel free to use that link now or after the event. And otherwise, I'm going to step out and leave it up to the two of you to have a good conversation.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, Rudy, you want to start out by just sort of telling people what your book is about, and then I'll tell people what my book is about?
Sure, that sounds good. Thank you, Charlie, and thanks to Matt and the bookstore for having us on. Let me start out by saying also thanks to Charlie because Charlie, you were kind enough to read my book. It's my first novel, and you're a seasoned published author, so I really appreciated you taking the time to read the book and so graciously, give such a wonderful review for the back covers. So thank you so much.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thank you. And yeah, so, just a little background on myself. Although this is my first novel, I've been writing, pretty much almost my whole life since I was a kid, and started writing stories in elementary school and high school. Loved reading from a very early age, and I'll get to that a little bit when we talk about your book, Charlie. But one of the things I love about Escaping Dreamland is some of the old book series that inspired some of the storyline, and so I grew up reading a lot of those books. So reading your book was kind of like this wonderful trip down memory lane, so grew up loving reading, writing, and then in college I got into studying literature and creative writing, and I became I'm a native of the U.S.-Mexico border, so not from San Diego, but from Texas, and the Texas-Mexico border. And I fell in love with the magical realism writing of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and other writers like Isabel Allende and some great poets like Octavio Paz from Mexico. And it kind of put the bug in me to want to write novels in the magical realism style. And so I actually started working on this novel back in 1998. And yeah, it's been a while. And I've published some nonfiction, published a lot of short stories. A few years ago, published a collection of short stories that did really well. It's called Seven for the Revolution. And then fortunately, after many years of editing, rewriting, looking for a publisher, Blackstone Publishing was wonderful enough to fall in love with Fulgencio, and the resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez came out. So on the same day as your book, which was this week on Tuesday. So it's wonderful to kind of have gone through that journey, with the novel, and it's a novel set on the border where I grew up in kind of a mythical town in the magical realism style, where sort of a lot of the lines between reality and fantasy, life and death, get blurred along the border in this story. That's a little bit about my background and how the book came to be. But please, now it's your turn. I'd love for our viewers to hear about you.
Just to say briefly, to say something about your book before I talk about my book. A lot of times I will pick up a book that is steeped in a culture that's unfamiliar to me, and it feels unfamiliar to me. And this book is steeped in a culture that's unfamiliar to me, and I just felt at home immediately. I'm not quite sure how you did it, but I guess one of the things that our two books have in common is that they really sort of submerge the readers in a place that none of the readers haven't been. In your case, as you said, it's a mythical town. In my case, it's New York City, but it's New York City 1906, and I don't think I have any readers out there who remember New York City from 1906. So Escaping Dreamland, also a Blackstone novel, also published 2 days ago, was inspired by the books that I read as a kid that first got me excited about writing. I mean, I'd written several novels about sort of highlights of English literature, but the books that first got me excited about writing were books like The Hardy Boys, the Hardy Boys mysteries and Tom Swift and these other children's series books. And I thought it'd be interesting to write about that time period when they were being created and the sort of culture that they came out of and the effect that they had. I love writing about stories and how stories affect us, our lives, our relationships, the world that we live in. But I thought, well, I knew there was a lot more than the Hardy Boys, and I knew certain secrets about the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and Tom Swift and these other series because I'd been an antiquarian bookseller back in the 1980s. And I knew, for instance, that Franklin W. Dixon, the author of the Hardy Boys, didn't really exist. And same ditto with Carroll and Keenan. I thought this could be kind of a cool thing to work into a novel. But I also had some earlier children's series books created by the same syndicate that had belonged to my grandfather when he was a little boy. So I pulled them down off the shelf. You can see his boyhood book plate there, and they were published in New York City in 1906, and so that got me thinking New York City 1906. And so I wrote a novel that's about 4 writers who are all passionate about these series books for children. One of them lives in 2010, and for him these books were a central part of his relationship with his father, and he's still kind of working out some issues to do with that relationship. And the other 3 authors live in the same city but in the early 20th century, and they are in the process of writing some of these children's series books. So it was a way to explore stories, and it was also a way to explore identity, because the fact that, like, this guy Franklin W. Dixon that I thought was my favorite writer when I was growing up wasn't a real person, didn't really exist, made me start thinking about layers of identity and the ways that we try to hide our identity based on societal pressures. And of course, there were a lot more societal pressures in 1906 even than there are today. And so, I think about, for example, my character Magda, who is a young German, she's from a German immigrant family living on the Lower East Side of New York. Her name's Magdalena Herzenberger, but that she goes by Magda, so that's a second name. And then she wants to sort of Americanize herself, so she starts calling herself Mary Stone. And then she wants to be accepted in a world that only accepts men, and so she sometimes disguises herself as Marcus Stone. And then she comes up with a pseudonym for the books that she's writing, Dexter Cornwall. So she has 5 different names and sort of these 5 layers of identity. So it turned out that little secret that I knew about Franklin W. Dixon not really existing led to it was an interesting door into writing a novel that was partly about identity. And then as I've come to realize in the last few months, the other thing the novel is really about how we move on after loss and tragedy. All the main characters have some sort of tragedy in their past. And I think that theme of the novel became really clear for me when we were in the editing process. My father passed away in February, and I spoke at his funeral. And my mom had died in the 1960s when he was just 29 years old. And I learned a lot about how you move on from loss by watching my dad's life. And I realized when I look at this novel that a lot of the things I learned from him are in this book. And that didn't really twig for me until I was speaking at his funeral. And I was like, oh yeah. So it's interesting to me how when we write, sometimes we don't even know where it's coming from until the book is out and we start thinking about it, at a little bit of a distance, you know. Do you find that at all, Rudy? Do you see your book differently now than you did when you were working on it?
I came to, yeah, you know, it's interesting, you know, given the crazy length of time that I worked on this novel, you know, the story kept evolving over time, and it's interesting what you mentioned about some of your inspirations and about how your father's passing away influenced you. I now notice as we talk about it that there's a lot more similarities or commonalities between our books than I originally, you know, thought at first blush. For me, my father was really sort of the big inspiration behind the character of Fulgencio Ramirez, and it was one of those experiences. I think when I grew up, he was always telling me all these great stories, personal stories about his upbringing on the border in the 1950s, the son of immigrants, and, you know, basically his quest for the American dream, but also this relationship he had when he was kind of younger. It was not my mom. It was like this love of his life that didn't work out, which is kind of a weird thing when you think about it. But a lot of interesting stories that he told me about those experiences. And being the first in his family to go to college, like Fulgencio is in the book, and sort of trying to make himself, I guess, what in his mind would be worthy of marrying this more affluent kind of American, more acculturated young woman. And interestingly, I think my experience writing the book was a little bit me, almost therapeutic, trying to understand. You know how you never kind of feel like you fully know your parents, like all, you know, fully, and you're trying to figure out some of the things that they must have kept private that shaped who they were, and you speculate maybe a little bit about those and what made them who they were in their totality, their complexity. So when my dad passed away, it was in 2015, so not that long ago, you know, 5 years ago. And I went back in 2015 and I did a major rewrite of the book, in part, again, kind of therapeutic, because I missed my dad and I felt like I was spending time with him when I was working on the book and when I was spending time with the character. Yeah. So it was almost comforting to me. But also, after having been working on the book, I guess basically at that point, about how many years would that be? About 18, 17 years. My view of the character evolved, you know, and there was kind of more nuance to it, more maturity to it. And I think it was a better book as a result of that.
Yeah. I was thinking about some of the things that our books have in common. I mean, certainly relationships between different generations. But also to me, it seems like that Fulgencio and certainly all three of my characters in 1906 are sort of pushing against the boundaries that have been set for them by a previous generation or by societal norms of the time. You know, like you said, Fulgencio is the first person in his family to go off to college. He's in love with a white girl. And when I think about, you know, my three characters in 1906, one of them is a child of wealth who lives in a fancy Fifth Avenue mansion, but is not really happy there, is much more interested in what's going on the streets with the boot blacks and the newsboys. One of them is a queer character, what we would call a gay man, although we didn't use that terminology in 1906, who's pushing against societal restraints. And then Magda, who's trying to be, you know, an independent woman at a time when that was, you know, a pretty difficult thing to do. So I started thinking about Fulgencio, and I thought, you know, really all four of these characters are in that mode of trying to create an identity for themselves in spite of the strictures that may be put on them culturally or societally or economically or you know, in other ways.
Yeah, I agree, and I think part of it's you know, some part of it is the immigrant experience. I think that both books touch on and explore the immigrant experience, and how when you are the child of immigrants or you are an immigrant yourself and suddenly you're in this amazing country, your identity is sort of in a way almost like pushed or forced to transform. You have to figure out how do you stay connected to your parents and your grandparents who maybe are more steeped in the old ways of where they came from, yet you're also trying to fit in with your friends and with your generation, with growing up in America. And so, it's the classic issue of generation gaps and acculturation. And I was like riveted when I was reading the scene in your book about Magda. And I don't want to give away too much of the book, but there's a tragic event that occurs where Magda survives this event, and because of the circumstances, I guess it suddenly occurs to her that this is a horrible thing, but then that it's also sort of an opportunity for her to as you said, kind of change her identity, if you will. And I'm curious kind of what inspired that. Like, I know sometimes we don't know where necessarily the ideas come from, but I was just curious. It was so moving to me when in that scene, when it happened. I wondered if there was something, a particular event or real life situation or something that inspired that.
Well, so I think it's okay for me to say what the event is because it's pretty early in the book, and it's a real historical event. So when I started researching the time period, I really was working on the time period and at the same time thinking, who might the characters be? And I discovered this event in the 14th of June, 1904, an excursion steamer full of mostly women and children from a Sunday school group that was going off for a picnic. On the East River in New York caught fire, and over 1,000 people lost their lives. It was the greatest loss of life in New York City prior to 9/11 from a single event. And I was just stunned that I'd never heard of it. And when I started asking other people, they're like, no, we've never heard of it either. And so really, Magda came from that event because I thought I have got to have a character on that boat. And so that means everybody who was on that boat was German immigrant families. At that time, the Lower East Side was the second largest German city in the world in terms of populations of German-speaking population. It went Berlin, the Lower East Side, and then like Munich and Hamburg and everything. And so that meant, I automatically knew sort of that she would be part of that immigrant community. But then I thought, that community was devastated by this tragedy. And in fact, a lot of the German families moved from the Lower East Side up to Yorkville and the Upper East Side in New York as a result of the Slocum disaster. And so I thought, well, that if Magda desperately wants to feel as American as she possibly can, here could be her moment. Her community is fracturing. She can be one of the shards that goes off. And then of course the question is, how will that result for her in the end? And I'm not going to talk about what happens later. But there's also a point right before she gets on the boat where, because to me, the city of New York is a character in this book. And I love being able to show characters in the same place in New York City in 2010 and in 1906, but then also to show how much the city has changed. But she goes to a library. It was the first free library in New York, the Freie Bibliothek, it still says on this building in German, Freie Bibliothek. And at the time that she walks in the door, in 1904, about half the books in that library were in German and half were in English. And so it's like this building is like this great sort of symbol of a community that's separate, but also at the same time trying to be American. And I love the fact that that building's still there. It's still a library. It's part of the New York Public Library system. And, I don't know if they have any German books in there anymore or not. I sort of hope that they do. But I love that being able to use physical places and buildings, both buildings that are still there and buildings that aren't there anymore, almost as characters in the book to show how a city evolves and changes and how things like a single event on the East River in 1904 helped shape New York City as we know it today.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I can't wait to find out what happens to Magda, and I'm really kind of intrigued by all the characters. Another thing I found really fascinating so far is, we talk a lot about the income inequality these days, and like the gaps, between the rich and the poor in our country, and it's something that's palpable right away in your book because you go from a character like Magda, who's, from an immigrant community, and then you have the character Thomas. I think he's the one that grew up on Fifth Avenue, right?
Yeah,
Thomas,
yeah.
and he comes from a very wealthy, and are they one of the established like Dutch families?
Yeah.
And so you just get this sense of like how, just like it is today. I mean, New York was like this incredibly, vivacious sort of place, but also just so the gulf between the rich and the poor was just like extreme.
Yeah, and I really wanted to try to. I mean, obviously, you could have 1,000 different characters and not show every side of New York. But if I was going to have 3 main characters, I wanted to try to show 3 really different experiences, but all of them clearly New York City experiences. But we've been talking a little bit about heritage, and one of the things I would love for you to talk a little bit about, because it surprised me and I was fascinated about it, is I thought, okay, well, here's this character Fulgencio, his heritage is going to be Hispanic, and then there's other characters here who are from north of the border, but Fulgencio has this other part of his heritage that's Aztec, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's an interesting question, and it's a great question because for anyone who's joining us that isn't aware of it, right now we're in the middle of or the beginnings of Hispanic Heritage Month here in the U.S. So it runs from September 16th through October 15th, and it's been around since like the Nixon presidency. And so in the Hispanic community, there's a lot of different cultural events and celebrations that go on. And I think that was one reason that Blackstone may have chosen to release the book in during Hispanic Heritage Month at this time. And if you take a look at the cover, it has that kind of historic heritage, cultural, folkloric type of aspect to it. It feels very, very Mexican American, if you will. And Fulgencio himself is the son of immigrants. His parents came from Mexico, but he's born in Texas. But his ancestors, some of them, they were born and raised in these ranch lands that back before the U.S.-Mexico War, which established the Rio Grande as the border in 1848. Those ranch lands were in what was Mexico back then, and the Fulgencio's family had this land that spanned both sides of the river. And when the U.S.-Mexico War happens, the river becomes the new border. And one of the phenomena that happened in South Texas was a lot of settlers from up north started coming down to Texas and trying to basically settle and populate and take some of that land and amass some of those huge ranches you always hear about in Texan history. So this happens to Fulgencio's family. There's some tragic stuff that happens at that time back in the past, and as a result of it, one of his ancestors that is a bruja, or kind of like a witch, if you will, from the old Mexican folk traditions, she weaves this curse, and this is part of the magical realism aspect of the book. But in her anger and in her haste, because she's lost her daughter, she ends up cursing the males in the family, which goes down from generation to generation, and eventually gets to Fulgencio in the 1950s and 1980s, and he's cursed and haunted, by this mystical curse that this distant ancestor of his wove. And when she wove that curse, she was drawing on type of kind of dark magic that has been practiced in Mexico, for generations, and part of the roots of that is in Aztec culture. So it is sort of implied that like most Mexicans, part of his heritage is Spanish, and then part of his heritage is of the indigenous cultures, of which the Aztecs were the most, probably one of the most prominent, if not the most powerful at the time of the colonization from Spain. So yeah, he's an interesting character. He's got that going on in the background that he's not even fully aware of, and he's trying to become an American at the same time, and be an American. He's born American, but he's trying to sort of attain the ideals of success in American society.
Yeah, it's funny listening to you talk about the curse and everything, because readers who haven't read this book might think, oh, it's gonna be fantasy or something, but the realism part of the magical realism in this book is so grounded that the magical part just seems I just completely accepted it. I never went, oh, that's weird. It just seemed to make perfect sense to me. We have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, does writing energize or exhaust you?
That's a great question. You want to take that one early?
I mean, for me, I would say both. Sometimes it depends on what day it is or what chapter I'm working on. I worked as a children's playwright for many, many years. And so when I get to dialogue scenes, I tend to just clip along because I'm just so used to writing dialogue. So those days I find energize me. Some days exhaust you. Research days are both for me. I mean, sometimes I'll spend hours trying to find something and I can't find it and it's exhausting. And other times, there were so many times in this particular book, especially where, I went to do some research because I wanted a character to have a certain experience or see something in a certain way. And the thing that I found out in my research was so much better than anything that I could have made up. I found those days really energizing,
Yeah. I agree. I think it's like any job, there's highs and there's lows. There's moments where you feel totally inspired and you're energized. And then maybe there's some days where you're working on something that you need to work through, but for some reason it doesn't come as naturally or as easily. And maybe you're not going to feel as efficient, and you're going to have to rewrite this. But you still do it because you got to push through it, obviously, and then you have to come back and maybe make it better. But I think one of the another dimension of writing that can be challenging is it's a little bit, I don't know what you think, but for me it's like a little bit it's a little bit of a solitary craft. So I feel sometimes that takes its toll. And I think anyone these days who has felt a little isolated because of the pandemic could probably relate to that feeling. If you're used to collaborating with people, you're talking to people, working with people, and a lot of the time when you're working on the first draft of a novel and you're not in the editing phase yet, you're all alone for a lot of hours.
Yeah, we have a lot of practice in the COVID world. People are like, "Oh, I'm working from home." I'm like, "Yeah, that's our lives."
Yeah, so that can be draining.
Somebody else asks, how do you decide what to keep in and more so what to leave out?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Sometimes I find that I think I've gotten better at this as I've written more novels, but it's important to figure out what the story is that you're trying to tell. And you may not figure that out even when you have a whole first draft written. You may be on the third draft before you figure out what that story is. But once I figure out what's the story I'm trying to tell, then it's not that hard to look at a paragraph or a sentence or a chapter and go, this is either contributing to telling that story or it's not contributing to telling that story. And if you wrote that paragraph 6 months ago, it's really easy to just chop it right out. If you wrote it this morning, it's a lot harder.
Yeah, I agree. And when I first started, I think the more you write, I think that like you said, that's something that you learn as you go along. And one thing in my experience was when I first started writing, I hated editing. I loved to write, and I wanted to believe that everything I wrote was great just as it was, and what did somebody know to give me advice about how to tell the story I was trying to tell, and that was at the beginning, like 20 years ago. And then the more I went through it and worked with people and worked with some great editors, I really learned to appreciate not only the input, but the whole editing process, the process of not just getting out the inspired story on the page, but making it a better story, trimming it down, shaping it, getting to the kernels of what you're trying to say, like you just described, and figuring out how do I get that across more effectively,
Yeah, and I think that's also where it's really helpful to have some trusted readers. I mean, for me, it's my wife and my agent really are my two that I can go to them and I can say, read this and really tell me what you think, and where, and they'll be honest with me, and I trust them and respect their opinions. They both read a ton, so they know what they're talking about. And sometimes you just need that extra set of eyes to say, look, you think you're going over here, but really you should probably go over here. And this book for me, I think, was especially true because it's a little bit less of a strict, mystery story from some of my previous books. It's maybe a little bit more of a character study. And so it was really helpful to have my agents say, we kept changing the beginning and changing the beginning, and we would add things to the beginning and take things off at the beginning until we finally felt like, okay, now, we're easing the reader in at just the right pace. But it's really nice to have those trusted readers that you can go to, and when you've got a draft done, and say, okay, they can help you with that question of identifying what your story is and how you can sort of get it headed in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you have, funny enough, for me, it's the same. I have the same. My wife, my agent, and my son Lorenzo, who's 16 years old, and he's like kind of always the first person to read anything I write these days. Ever since he's been old enough to do so, and it's great. It's great to get those perspectives. Sometimes you always want to hear this is so great, but sometimes you have to hear the hard truth, like something's not resonating, something's not ringing authentic, and it's those people that you really count on to give it to you like it is.
Yeah, and for those of us who have books coming out this week, we'd rather hear that information 18 months ago than tomorrow morning, So,
yeah,
one of the things we did when we started, our COVID lives, and we were both at home all day long, and our kids are growing away, and we didn't even have our COVID puppy yet at this point. But I read aloud not this book, but the next one that's still, it's finished, it's finished in that there's a draft finish. But I read that aloud to my wife sitting out here on this back porch in April, and she had a lot of little things, and we got to the end, the last sort of 20 pages or so, when like the big thing happens, and she had a one sentence comment that was so incisive, and it allowed me to make that last 20 pages so much better, which made the whole book so much better, And so it's also, I find it's really great to have the opportunity to read my stuff out loud, because you hear the rhythm of the sentences. And I know for you, like the sound of your language, I kept wondering, is it because he speaks Spanish, and Spanish is a more musical, like Romance languages are more musical than Germanic languages, but your prose felt musical to me in places,
Wow. Well, thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it. Yeah, you always hear like people think of the Romance languages as very lyrical, like that, and sort of rhythmic, and the one of the, I actually was raised speaking Spanish first. Spanish was my first language, and then when I was 5 years old, my parents put me in kindergarten, and I basically didn't speak a word of English that first day of kindergarten, and I started learning, And yeah, I picked it up, fortunately, pretty quickly. But I was able to continue to grow up bilingual. And one of the great things about this story is it's a very bilingual story, as you saw.
Yeah.
And I pepper in a lot of Spanish phrases. There's one of the aspects of Fulgencio's character is that he's got this great singing voice, and he sings to really express his emotions at any given time in the story. And so there's about 8 or 9 traditional Mexican songs that are sprinkled throughout the novel that in a way end up capturing his journey, his emotional journey of falling in love and being passionately in love with Carolina, his high school sweetheart. Then the heartbreak that he goes through, and then really what the story sort of is all about is him trying to win her back and redeem himself. And those songs, I'm going to put a comment here in the comment section, but I created a Spotify playlist, and it's been a real fun thing. So I just put that in the comment section. And so basically, I grew up listening to these songs being sung by my own father. Actually, he had a great voice. So the songs, my original intent back when I started writing the book was to try to get my father into a recording studio and have him sing these songs. And back in those days when I started writing the book, I thought I could see the book being published with a CD, inserted. And of course now, by the time the book's being published, CDs are out and Spotify is in. So
have a playlist is all you need. Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I was never able to get my dad into the studio, but he did help me curate the songs. Back then you couldn't find the lyrics online, so he hand wrote all the lyrics out for me, and then I typed them up and put them in the book. And then Blackstone went through the process of getting the lyrics reprint rights for them. But the Spotify playlist was a lot of fun to kind of create, and when you listen to it, you kind of get immersed, like you said, in the culture.
And you translate the lyrics, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. The songs are in Spanish, and I just felt like for the English reader to most of the phrases that I put in the book in Spanish, the context allows the reader to understand what the phrase means. But for the songs, I thought, that's too difficult. I mean, nobody's going to want to retype these, go into Google Translate and try to figure out what these lyrics mean. So we did translate. I translated the lyrics into English, and they go side by side, so that the song is not so skippable for the reader. You can read the song and you can say, I see how he's singing about his feelings.
Yeah, I had that similar experience because Magda very much doesn't want to speak German. She wants to speak English, but in her household, when she's growing up, German is the language that's being spoken. And, at that time, there were almost as many German language newspapers in cities like New York and Philadelphia as there were English language newspapers. But like you said, you don't want to confuse your reader. So, there's certain, like you can have somebody say Guten Morgen, or, there's certain phrases in Spanish that, are sort of part of our cultural idiom. But then other places where, maybe her sister says something in German and Magda repeats part of it in English as part of the next sentence. So it was an interesting challenge to work in part of another language, but as you said, in a way that's not going to confuse the reader. And what I kept thinking about when I was reading your book is I thought, how are they going to handle this when they translate this book into Spanish? Are there going to be some English phrases that are worked into the Spanish translation, or that? So that interesting to see.
That's a good question. Well, we another really cool thing that Blackstone agreed to do was publish the Spanish language version simultaneously. So it is out there in Spanish. And the reason I felt that was important, I just kind of felt, like I mentioned, I've published some previous work, and in one of the books was a nonfiction book that was actually in Spanish, and the readers would always ask me like if we were going to have the English version, because a lot of families, like the ones that we just described, are bilingual families, And the younger generation might want to read it in English. The older generation might want to read it in Spanish or German, as was the case in those days in the early 1900s in New York. And if you have both languages available, the family, instead of this being another part of the generation gap, this is something the family can share. So they can both, elders and the youngsters can read the same book and talk about it and connect over it. So I'm excited about that. Now, the Spanish version doesn't really have any English in it, though.
Yeah.
It's just kind of.
But you wrote the Spanish version.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. See, I think that's fantastic because there's very few novels that are like that where there's two languages, both written by the actual author of the novel. Usually somebody, I have novels that are where I wrote them in English and somebody else wrote Spanish or French or German or so I think that's fantastic. We had another question about research, which was, did we find anything when we were doing our research that we didn't include? And I started thinking about this, and I'm sure I found tons of stuff that I didn't include, but of course I've forgotten it all because I didn't include it. But my research, I did a little bit of reading, history books, but I was not really that interested in 1906 New York as filtered through the eyes of a PhD candidate in 1985. I wanted to know what it was like for the people on the ground at the time. So most of my research was newspapers. A lot of it was newspapers of the time period, which is great because you start to hear, the rhythm of the language that they used at the time. English is used differently in different time periods. And just there was so much newspaper being published in New York at the time, morning and evening editions, lots of different papers, that just the amount of detail on some of these stories, like the Slocum story, for instance, all these little details that you could use to just bring it to life. But there were several. I'll just give one example of one of the things I found out in my research that I did include because it was one of those things that's better than you can imagine. So being set in 1906, the only thing I knew about 1906 when I started was, there was a big earthquake in San Francisco. So I have one of my characters in San Francisco during the earthquake, and he has a pretty traumatic experience. And then when we get to one of the culminating scenes of the novel is in a Coney Island amusement park called Dreamland, hence the title, Escaping Dreamland. And this amusement park had they had an attraction called Fighting the Flames. And literally you would go in there and you would sit in this arena and there was this building and they would light it on fire. And then firemen would come in and put out the fire, and people would jump out of the windows of the third floor and be caught in a net. And it was kind of like the Indiana Jones show at Hollywood Studios, in Disney World. And the San Francisco earthquake took place in April of 1906, and Dreamland opened for the season in May. And so I'm reading the papers about the opening of the season, and in that short month, they have rebranded and recreated Fighting the Flames, and they're now calling it the Great San Francisco Earthquake. And I was like, how can I be this lucky that I get to have a character who has this real traumatic experience, and then he has to go with his friends to like an entertainment version of the worst day of his life. Like that's a novelist's dream to have a situation like that. So to me, like, I love those moments in research where, like, I never would have thought of doing that, and the research led me into that opportunity.
Wow, I love some of the historical details in your novel, and I was wondering when you talk about the San Francisco earthquake, I was so like shocked, in that scene, when I was reading that scene, because you surprised the reader just in the way I would imagine that the characters were surprised when it happened. Like, I think it was something like Thomas is standing in front of the bed and then suddenly the floor fell out from under him or something like that. And he falls back and the furniture is all going backwards. And I'm like, what's happening?
Yeah.
What's happening? And it's like, it felt like almost, I mean, obviously not, because, you don't want to equate it with the real disaster, but it just felt like the confusion that perhaps the character was feeling at that instant at the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think it was helpful in that situation to have a character who had only arrived on the West Coast, like a day or two before. And so it wasn't like people who lived out there, it's like, yeah, this was a much bigger earthquake than they'd felt before. But I think people who lived there probably knew right away this is an earthquake. Whereas Thomas is like has at least a few seconds has no idea what's going on. You know, it's literally just the floor drops up from underneath him. And it was that was interesting to try to research because of course there weren't nearly as many immediate eyewitness newspaper accounts because the telegraph wires were all down. There was no electricity. The newspaper buildings were on fire. And so that one, the research was, like Simon Winchester's book, A Crack at the Edge of the World, was great. But when I found out that Enrico Caruso was in town to sing opera, during the earthquake, I thought that's just too good not to work into the book someplace.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if that was a real historical, factual event, his performance there.
Yeah, I mean, all the historical events that I include are real. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, how do you decide what historical events to plug into your fictional narrative? And I said, really, the way I ask the question is the other way around, which is, how can my fictional characters live through or interact with these historical events or these historical people? And if you ask the question that way, to me, it feels less forced. Because they were living at the time. They were living at a time when you could walk down the streets of New York and run into Nikola Tesla or Mark Twain or Stanford White or John Singer Sargent. So why not have them cross paths with those people? Because it just makes it fun for the reader.
Absolutely. So just one last question on the research thing, because I was curious. I love the cover of your book. And I was very sort of drawn in by the illustration of Dreamland, and so I was just curious if that was drawn, kind of came from some original drawings or photos that you found in your research.
So here it is. I don't know how well you can see it, but this I used a lot of postcards in my research. And most of them were not very nicely colored, or else they were just in black and white. But I found on eBay, this was the only copy of this postcard I ever found that had these really lovely colors, this picture of Dreamland. And so the great Sean Thomas, the designer at Blackstone, took this and made that fantastic cover. And we also took some original atlases from the time period that were done for the fire department that were digitized by the New York Public Library, and created these end papers that have an actual map of Dreamland on the end papers. But I was so picky and Sean was so cooperative that literally, if you look super closely on this postcard, you can actually see where it says "Fighting the Flames." Wow. And I'm like, no, the San Francisco earthquake now. And so I had Sean remove the lettering from the front of the building.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. So in the cover, there's no lettering there, right?
Yeah, there's no lettering. It's just the front of the building. But Dreamland was sort of based on or inspired by the White City, the Chicago 1893 World's Fair. So it was all white, and it had a million light bulbs that came on at night. At a time when, I don't know that there were a million light bulbs in Midtown Manhattan at that time period. So it was a special place. But I think awesome. Your novel too, I think, is really rooted in place. I think we both have that in common too. That the place is almost a character, and I think especially the ranch that they go to and ride around, and there's the ghost of the priest, I guess, who lives in the house, and they go back to visit him all the time. I just felt like I was there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love that aspect of your book as well. For me, this place is, really where I grew up. So I think that's why it came so naturally for me to capture it with authenticity and really, I try to be vivid in my descriptions of things and place the reader there. I'm a movie buff, so I like to visualize everything as I'm writing, and I like the reader to be able to visualize it. And some people do tell me hey, I felt like I was watching a movie, and when I was reading your book, and I love that. And for example, one of the questions that we've been asked in the queue here has to do with magical realism and how it helped to tell the story of the border. I think for me, the magical realism was real helpful because I wanted to draw on the real setting of the U.S.-Mexico border, but I also didn't want to be too literal about it. And since it's set in the past and it does move back and forth through time periods, the 50s, the 80s, and then the 2000s, I sort of wanted to blur the lines of time too. And magical realism was kind of a helpful style to do that in. Some of the places, like the ranch that you mentioned, that ranch is called El Dos de Copas. And El Dos de Copas means the two of cups, which is kind of like the lowest card in the Spanish deck of playing cards, kind of like having the two of hearts, let's say. And so what it was to represent that the person who owned the ranch before Fulgencio, which was his grandfather, he was pretty unlucky guy. He had the family curse, and like all the men for generations, they'd had this family curse. So they'd gambled away and lost the women they loved and the land that they loved, and like this was all that was left, was this little patch of dirt that was kind of worthless, like the lowest card in the deck, But it was worthless from a monetary perspective, but it was priceless from sort of a cultural, spiritual heritage perspective to Fulgencio and like his family. And so I just tried to capture that. And that was inspired by, just like Fulgencio was inspired by my dad, the ranch was inspired by a ranch that my dad inherited like that in Mexico. It was called El Dos de Copas. And my dad used to take me out there when I was a little kid. So, of course, I fictionalize it. I didn't really get to hang out with the ghost of the priest and his grandfather and all that, darn. But I imagined it, and that's the beauty of magical.
Yeah. I mean, I love what you said about thinking cinemagraphically, because I do that too. I mean, I literally will close my eyes and imagine where all the characters are. And I'm like, okay, no, she has to cross over the room before she can say that, because otherwise, and I get really picky about that. But I find if I can get the scene to the point where I can see it unspooling like a movie, then it's real to me. And then if it's real to me, I feel like I can make it real to the reader. And that's an especial challenge for me with historical fiction, because the art direction all has to be up here. I can't look around and see. I can't sit myself in the middle of historic New York City. My most recent novel before this, The Lost Book of the Grail, was set in a medieval Gothic cathedral, and I was in England. They're all over the place, and I can go sit in one of those all day long, no problem. But I couldn't do that with New York, and so creating that movie in my head then has this other layer of challenge. And then where postcards and photographs and newspapers, and I love looking at advertisements in newspapers too. I found some great stuff from newspaper ads, partly just factual things, but also when you look at how people are trying to sell things to other people in a certain time period, you learn a lot about how people think and interact by the way that people try to market things to them. And so that's why I love like fully digitized newspapers, where it's an actual, digital image of the whole paper, not just, not just the text, because then you get, you get these crazy photographs, and you get to see the typeface, and you get to see the ads and the way the layout works and all of that. Like you learn from all of those things, to me.
Yeah, you're right. You pick up so much about like the culture of the time. And then I love, it seems to me like a lot of the old newspapers, when I happen to look at, at them, they had so much kind of detailed minutia in woven into the articles that I don't feel like you see today in the same way. Maybe it's because people put the minutia in their social media, and then the news organizations just have like very factual stories or something. I don't know what, but it's interesting.
I guess some of it is the fact that now, so much of news is like, what can you see on the video? And like, if you can show a video but they couldn't show a video. And so they had to describe, like you said, all these details. And there were places where I literally would lift a sentence or even 2 or 3 sentences out of a newspaper article from 1906 and plug it right into my prose. And if it fit, if I could go back a week later and not be able to tell which sentence was from the newspaper and which was mine, then I knew that I was getting the rhythm of the language right.
Wow, that's awesome. How cool. This has been a lot of fun, Charlie. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you and learning about your process and talking about our books.
Yeah, ditto. It's funny, just in the process of the conversation, I knew there were points of convergence in our books, but as we've talked, I feel like I've discovered a lot more of them. Yeah,
me too. I'm looking forward to finishing the book, and I'll reach out to you when I do to share to share the feelings that are brought up in me.
And for those of you who are podcast listeners, Rudy's going to be on my podcast, Inside the Writer's Studio, on the October 1st episode. So we get to talk again next week, which will be fun too.
Awesome. Good. I will have made some more progress on the book.
We got a little sneak peek of that here.
Yeah.
So that's a great segue into my last question for you guys, which is, what are you working on next, and where should we find you?
Rudy?
I am working on a book called The Valley of Shadows, which is the second book in my 2-book contract with Blackstone Publishing, and it's exciting for me because it sort of continues this magical realism adventure along the border. But I branch out and I go a little bit further back in time, closer to the time period you were just writing about, Charlie. So I'm getting to do historical research. It's set in 1883 in West Texas, and it follows the story of an ancestor of Fulgencio's, who is a Mexican lawman who ends up finding himself stranded on the northern side of the Rio Grande after the river shifts course, and he has to keep the peace in West Texas as a Mexican American lawman. So it's an interesting, and he's haunted by the same curse Fulgencio is.
So I have next, I'm not very busy these days. Next, I have, in 2021, I have a nonfiction book coming out. I'm a collector and scholar of Lewis Carroll, and I have a new biography of him coming out that is essentially a religious biography, which is his religious side was very important to him, but it's been mostly ignored by a lot of his other biographers. So that's coming out from an academic press. I have the first book of a middle grade trilogy, the Book of the Seven Spells, we think is coming out in the spring. COVID has sort of thrown some of the smaller publishers for a loop, and so we're not sure exactly the schedule on that. And then the new novel that I said that I read to my wife that she gave me such a great help with is your basic small town librarian teams up with professional assassin to solve 75-year-old Nazi mystery. I wanted to write kind of more of a straight thriller, and it was really fun. I took a page from some of those Hardy Boys books, and I put my characters in peril on a regular basis, and that sort of stuff. So that was great fun. And you can find me online at charlielovett.com or my podcast Inside the Writer's Studio, which comes out every 2 weeks, and I interview other authors. And we have conversations a lot like this. So if you enjoyed this, you'll probably enjoy the podcast.
Well, this has been such a great conversation. I'm really excited to check out both your books because I grew up reading the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. Like, we had that whole collection of the blue and the yellow books just scanned across the bookshelves. And I'm now really big into magical realism as well. Like, I love Borges and Garcia Marquez and Ricardo Piglia. So these two sound right up my alley. So make sure for everyone listening that you go ahead and order those signed books below. And you have up until 1 week after the event to put an order in for the signed book. And otherwise, thank you to both of the authors so much for joining us, and we will call it a night.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and talk to you soon, Charlie.
Hey, bye.